Story 1. The Room That Wasn't There. When I rented the small cottage, the landlord mentioned an odd quirk. Don't use the room at the end of the hall. I thought it was just one of those eccentric rules. Maybe the room was under renovation or something. It wasn't locked, but I respected the request, at least for the first week. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I opened the door and found a completely ordinary room. A single bed, a wooden dresser, and a dusty mirror on the wall. But something felt wrong. The air was heavy and the temperature was noticeably colder. That night, I dreamt of the room. In the dream, I was standing in the doorway watching myself asleep on the bed inside. Except it wasn't me. The thing on the bed looked like me, but its face was twisted in an unnatural grin, and its eyes were hollow black pits. It whispered in a voice that wasn't mine, "Come join me." I woke up drenched in sweat, but the worst part was that my bedroom door, which I always locked, was wide open. From that point on, the room began to intrude on my life. The door would be ajar in the mornings, and I could hear faint laughter coming from inside late at night. One evening I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to confront whatever was in there. I opened the door and stepped inside. The air was freezing and the mirror on the wall reflected not me, but that twisted version of myself. It raised a hand and the door slammed shut behind me. The next tenant never saw me. The room was locked when they moved in, and they were told the same thing I was. Don't use the room at the end of the hall. Story 2. The Vanishing Hitchhiker. It was late, and the rain was relentless as I drove down the winding country road. My headlights barely cut through the darkness, and I was exhausted. That's when I saw her, a woman standing by the side of the road, soaked to the bone, waving frantically. I pulled over and rolled down the window. She looked terrified. "Can you take me home?" she asked, her voice trembling. She climbed into the back seat and gave me an address not far from where I was headed. She didn't say much during the drive, and I didn't push. Her eyes were distant, and her hands clutched her drenched coat. When I arrived at the address, she whispered, "Thank you," and got out. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Curious, I drove back to the address. It was an old house, run down and clearly abandoned. As I stood there, an elderly neighbor approached. "Looking for someone?" she asked. "Yeah, a woman I gave a ride to last night. She said this was her home." The woman paled. "That's impossible. No one's lived here for years." "But that sounds like Clara. She was hit by a car on this road 20 years ago." I didn't believe her until I checked my back seat. The spot where she'd been sitting was soaking wet, even though it hadn't rained since that night. Story 3. The Clock That Stopped. I've always had a thing for antiques, so when I found an old grandfather clock at a flea market, I couldn't resist. The seller seemed eager to part with it, which I thought was odd, but I figured I was just getting a good deal. The clock didn't work, but I liked it as a decorative piece. It wasn't until later that I noticed it. The hands were stuck at 3:33, but every night, without fail, I'd wake up at exactly that time. One night, I decided to stay up and see if anything happened. At 3:33, the clock chimed, loud and clear. I stared at it in disbelief. The hands hadn't moved, but the chime echoed through the room. Then I heard it, faint footsteps upstairs. I live alone. Grabbing a flashlight, I crept up to the second floor. The footsteps stopped when I reached the top of the stairs, but the air was heavy and I felt a presence. When I turned back to look at the clock downstairs, the hands were moving backward. The next morning, I returned the clock to the flea market, but the seller was gone. The stall was empty and no one remembered anyone selling clocks there. I haven't seen it since, but every night at 3:33 I wake up and for a moment I hear that chime. Story 4, The Uninvited Guest. It was supposed to be a small gathering, just a few friends at my new apartment. We were drinking, laughing, and having a good time when someone knocked on the door. I wasn't expecting anyone else, but I opened it. A man stood there, pale and expressionless. He didn't say a word, just stared at me. I asked if he needed help, but he stepped inside without answering. I felt a chill as he passed me. "Who's that?" one of my friends asked, but when I turned to point him out, he was gone. We searched the entire apartment, but there was no sign of him. Everyone brushed it off as a prank or a misunderstanding, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, watching. That night, after everyone left, I felt it. The air in the room was heavy, and every shadow seemed to stretch toward me. Then, in the corner of my bedroom, I saw him. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there staring. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, he was gone, but the feeling of being watched has never left. Story 5, The Figure in the Fog. It was a foggy morning when I took my usual jog through the park. The path was eerily quiet, with the fog swallowing the trees and muffling every sound. That's when I saw it, a figure standing in the mist far down the path. At first, I thought it was another jogger, but something about the way they stood made me uneasy. Their posture was rigid, unnatural. As I got closer, they didn't move, didn't even flinch. They were just there. I decided to turn back, but when I glanced over my shoulder, the figure was gone. Relieved, I continued my jog, until I saw them again, this time standing by the edge of the path, closer than before. I sprinted back toward the park entrance, my heart pounding. When I finally reached my car, I thought I was safe. But as I unlocked the door, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the window. The figure was standing right behind me. Story 6, The Silent Village. I had been driving all day through the countryside, heading toward a cabin my friend had rented for the weekend. My GPS went haywire just as the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging me into darkness. I should have turned back, but I was tired, and the idea of a warm bed pushed me to keep going. That's when I saw the sign, "Welcome to Greystone Village." The name wasn't familiar, but I figured I could stop and ask for directions. The village was eerily quiet, with no sign of life. The cobblestone streets were cracked, and the windows of the houses were dark. I parked near what looked like a town square and got out of the car. As I walked, I noticed something strange. The air felt thick, like it was pressing down on me. And then I heard it, faint whispers too low to make out. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I called out, but my voice sounded muffled, as if the air itself swallowed the sound. Finally, I spotted a small shop with a light on inside. Relieved, I pushed the door open, but no one was there. The shelves were covered in dust, and the air smelled of decay. I was about to leave when I noticed a journal lying open on the counter. The pages were filled with frantic writing. "They come when it's dark. Don't let them see you. Don't let them hear you." I slammed the journal shut and froze. The whispers were louder now, clearer. They weren't just random murmurs, they were voices chanting something I couldn't understand. My heart pounded as I backed out of the shop and ran toward my car. But the car wasn't where I'd left it. The square was empty, and the streetlights flickered ominously. Panic set in as I tried to retrace my steps, but the streets seemed to twist and change, leading me in circles. The whispers grew deafening, and I felt a presence, many presences, watching me. I turned a corner and saw them, shadowy figures, dozens of them, standing silently in the street. Their faces were featureless, and their bodies seemed to flicker like static on a screen. They didn't move, but I could feel their eyes on me, boring into my soul. I ran. I don't know how long or how far, but eventually I found myself at the village entrance. My car was there, engine running as if waiting for me. I didn't question it, I just jumped in and sped away, never looking back. When I finally reached the cabin and told my friend what had happened, he stared at me in disbelief. "Greystone Village doesn't exist," he said. "There's nothing out there but empty fields." Story 7. The Forgotten Hospital. I had just started my residency at a hospital on the outskirts of town. It was an old building, parts of which had been abandoned for years. Most of the staff avoided the East Wing, which was locked up and in disrepair. They said it was haunted, but I thought it was just another urban legend. One night, I was on call and decided to explore the East Wing. The power had gone out earlier in the evening, so the hospital was running on backup generators. Armed with a flashlight, I made my way down the dimly lit corridors. The air was colder in the East Wing, and the silence was oppressive. Dust covered everything, and the faint smell of antiseptic lingered. I passed empty patient rooms, their beds covered in sheets. It felt like the entire place was holding its breath. Then I heard it, the sound of a gurney's wheels squeaking against the floor. I froze, shining my flashlight down the hallway, but there was nothing there. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was right behind me. I spun around, but the corridor was empty. Shaking, I pressed on, convincing myself it was just my imagination. I reached the nurse's station and found a stack of old patient files. One of the names caught my eye, Eleanor Harper. According to the file, she had been admitted 50 years ago and died under mysterious circumstances. As I read, I heard a faint voice whisper, "Help me." I turned, and there she was, a woman in a hospital gown, standing at the end of the hall. Her face was pale and her eyes were hollow, dark pits. She started walking toward me, her bare feet leaving bloody prints on the floor. Panicking, I ran. The gurney's squeaking sound followed me, along with her whispers. "Don't leave me. Please help." I burst through the door into the main wing, slamming it shut behind me. The sound stopped and I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath. My coworkers found me there, pale and trembling. I told them what I'd seen, but they just exchanged uneasy glances. The next morning, I went back to the East Wing with a senior doctor. The hallways were empty and there were no bloody footprints. But when we reached the nurse's station, I saw Eleanor Harper's file lying open on the desk. I transferred to another hospital shortly after. But sometimes late at night, I hear the faint squeak of a gurney's wheels, and I remember the way her eyes looked, like she was still waiting for someone to save her.